and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today to moderate this panel. Let me first thank you. It's been a long day, and I see the audience, you are now numerous and still excited and alert, so thank you. First of all, for being here. Secondly, for choosing this particular panel because you have many other options to go to. We're very grateful to you. And let me now welcome the first group of panelists to the stage. And I will call on them. Some of them are still on their way in from other sessions, so if you don't see them coming up, they will come on later. We first have Honorable Susana Mohammed, Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. I hope she's already arrived or she's on her way. Then we have Dr. Pepukai Bardui. Pep. Right, Minister, welcome. Dr. Pepukai Bardui. Hi, Pep. She's Director, Bridgetown Initiative and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Climate Resilience, Barbados. Please welcome. Then we have Director Kurt van den Berg. He's Director General in the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate, cutely known as DG Klima, and so the man in charge of the European Green Deal transformation plan. And then my very good friend, the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell, Member of Parliament, Minister of State in the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and the UK's Minister for Development and for Africa. Welcome. So, ladies and gentlemen, you are most welcome. Before we start our discussion, let me briefly explain why we are having this conversation and what you can expect to hear in the 90 minutes. We hope to keep you entertained. The core issue here is that there isn't nearly enough climate finance at work in Africa. We've heard since this morning how important it is, nature finance, climate finance, but there isn't enough. And the contribution from the domestic private sector and the domestic financial sector in particular isn't much, but it's much too low for what the continent needs. So just to give you some figures, you may have heard this or read them in other reports before. Total climate finance in Africa today stands at about $30 billion, and 85% of that comes from outside Africa. And that creates a dependency that Africa does not want, and it exposes Africa to the volatility in global financial markets, exchange rate risks. I heard today that the new risk to be covered over and above country risk is exchange rate risk, and other risks. So what this panel is about to discuss is ways of reducing and perhaps eliminating this dependency and vulnerability, and making Africa's growth and development more resilient and allowing its leaders to have more control over the economic destiny of their countries. Well-functioning domestic financial markets are a fundamentally important part of this vision. With the right incentives, they can be the engine that drives growth. They can provide the spark that ignites innovation. We want domestic financial institutions to be the ones to get behind successful models of innovation and scale these up, which is essential if Africa is to achieve a just and green transition. But the brutal reality is that domestic private financial firms are only playing a marginal role at the moment. Today, in the panel that just ended, I was one out of 12 speakers from the private sector financial industry. So research from the Climate Policy Initiative funded by FSD Africa shows that only 3% of total climate finance in Africa, so that's about $830 million out of this 30 billion that I mentioned, comes from African financial institutions. And yet, collectively, African sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and other institutional investors have an estimated $1.4 trillion in assets under management. So with this panel, we hope to pinpoint some of the practical ways African financial market leaders can intervene to strengthen innovation, boost competitiveness, and drive a large-scale increase in climate and nature-positive investment. We'll carry out the conversation in this session in 3 sequential discussions. The first discussion, which I will moderate, focuses on policy and regulation, where we are already seeing a lot more facilitative policy and regulatory environment for green finance than in the past. The second section focuses on instruments and financial infrastructure, the conduits for green finance. So the question we're asking there is the right engineering in place to allow the capital to flow to where it's needed. And then the last section focuses on project preparation. Everybody complains there's no pipeline, there are resources, but no pipeline. So this session will focus on that and what we need to do to create projects that can absorb much larger volumes of capital. Before closing, I want to suggest that we are in fact on the right track. Right up and down the finance value chain and in the policy-making environment, there's been some very significant innovation. We need to recognize this and lock it in. But I'm sure we can all agree that much, much more is needed. So with those brief opening remarks, let me now turn to Madame Susanna, the Minister Susanna Mohammed, Honorable Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. As we speak, your country is hosting the Finance in Common Summit, where when you look at the themes in that summit, they're really focused on climate and nature finance and innovations on how the world can tackle these problems. So I'm very grateful that you left that very important forum to come here. So let me ask you, first I salute Colombia for that and its leadership and commitment to that summit. So what can you share with us today in terms of the wider objectives of financing climate and nature and what your country has done and that the rest of us, particularly in Africa, can take away from? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. From President Gustavo Petro, it was very important for us as Colombia to be here in the African Union Summit on Climate, because we think that we are facing a similar challenge in financing climate within the South countries. For us, this challenge is called debt. Foreign debt is eating part of our fiscal space to be able to finance the very needed adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damages that we are already suffering all around the world. It is a very unjust system where we as more vulnerable countries face the difficulty of accessing more expensive capital. And the more that climate change hits our countries with disasters, the more our grades in the international financial system go down and our access to capital is more expensive. 71% currently of financing for climate mitigation comes through debt, and very few is actually coming to adaptation. And the answer in some of these meetings is that private sector financing will be the one helping us to fill that gap of finance. From Colombia, we don't believe that to be truth because of a simple reason. Private money will go where there is profitability. And when you have whole population in need to adaptation, or where you need to recover ecosystems, or where you need to attend humanitarian crises caused by climate change, this is not profitable. The planning processes and the structural adaptation processes in our country not necessarily are profitable. If we leave financing to that profitability criteria only, we will leave millions of people in the frontiers, in the first lines of climate change. And we have as states a very big responsibility. So our answer is actually to strengthen the public sector and the capacity of governments multilaterally to plan this climate transition process. How do we do that? What can be some one or two answers that we are putting forward for discussion? First, we think we need to see climate as an emergency, similar of how we saw COVID as an emergency. Because we only have 7 years to reach the Paris Agreement goals, which means shifting whole systems of society in a very short time. Similarly, when you needed to react in a very short time to a health crisis. If we define that climate is an emergency and needs to be addressed as such now, we suggest that the IMF, and this is where we come to some structural proposals, use SDR, special drawing rights, similarly to how they did it in COVID. There is an unfair system there as well, because who can access more SDRs are the countries that have more GDP, which means countries that are better able to actually adapt to climate and mitigate climate are the ones that have more access to lower capital and to SDRs. We propose to change that in the IMF, and that the SDR's rights can be accessed in a combination of evaluation between vulnerability to climate and GDP. And that we create a guarantee fund where we put developed countries SDRs, they have more SDRs that they need, and developing countries and medium rent countries SDRs into something like a guarantee fund. This guarantee fund will be used by countries to increase their ratings of debt to AAA quality all around the world, so that we can refinance our debt and put interest rates down. For example, in Colombia, we are paying 33% interest rates. Just the debt between 2023 and 2024 budget increasing 30%. If we can create such mechanism, our debt and our negotiation with private and multilateral creditors should bring our interest rate to 3%. And we can make a pact, a global pact. It's a political pact, not a market pact. It's a political pact where we together put those interest rates for 10 years in a stable way, and that allows a country such as Colombia to use that before we have to pay every year to foreign debt, to use it for climate action. That will give us concrete access into our financial budgets from the state, a fiscal space that would allow us systematically for 10 years to invest in our commitments. But we could also bring that extra money to create regional game-changing climate projects. For example, what we have done in South America with the 8 Amazon countries coming with a plan to save the Amazon basin. But we also could, for example, think how we can eliminate landfills so that we stop emissions of methane from waste. Or we could think about what we are proposing in South America, an electric line between Alaska to Patagonia that allow us to fill it with renewable energy, and we help the United States to decarbonize. This type of game-changing projects in 10 years with fiscal space and real flows of money, I think will allow us to make a difference rather than continuously thinking that having more debt to finance climate or the private sector money will help us to solve this crisis where we don't have any more time.
All right, thank you very much, Honorable Minister. You raised 2 really critical points, the role of the private sector, innovations like SDR, but you focused on concrete examples of your own domestic solutions to solve the problem. So it gives me an opportunity now to turn to Dr. Pep. You took leave from the World Bank to go and do something really critical, which is advise the Prime Minister of Barbados on climate issues, but also to be the director of the Bridgetown initiative. Now, the Bridgetown initiative has been well received as a focus on reforming the global financial architecture. And some have argued that it really doesn't talk much about the private sector and domestic financing in particular. So what would you say about that? What's the role of domestic capital in the private sector within the Bridgetown initiative?
Thank you. Okay, that should be working. Thank you. And always difficult to follow a passionate speaker, so thank you for your comments. I think fundamentally, the thought process behind the Bridgetown initiative is that we need a huge amount of capital increase from multiple directions. The private sector is certainly part of that. There is a specific piece within Bridgetown that speaks about catalyzing $1.5 trillion in private financing. But the approach or the mechanism is through the public sector. That is not the only way to catalyze private finance, but within Bridgetown, I think we see it as one of the key approaches. The reality is that we're on the continent of Africa, which has resources that can attract private financing through carbon credits, right? There are other mechanisms. If you think about small island developing states, which are essentially large ocean states, blue carbon is not yet there, but needs to get to a point where it's providing significant resources. But if I think about the domestic private sector, the reality is that when we talk about the need to catalyze, let me know if there's feedback, to catalyze that 1.5 or $2 trillion annually in private financing, much of it needs to come from domestic markets. One of the major challenges that has been raised on this platform, both in the plenary and in many of the side events and parallel sessions, is project development financing. I know that you're going to come to that point, Franny, a little bit later. But the reality is that even if we get past the hurdle of developing high-quality projects, de-risking those projects, what has been spoken about again and again is both the real and perceived risk that then affects the interest rates. And those are interest rates for foreign exchange. If we are looking at domestic money, which needs to come to the table, we need to develop deep and rich domestic private capital markets. We can look at the rate of growth of renewable energy projects in India, which is potentially transformative. The bottleneck there is not the lack of projects, it's the lack of depth in domestic private markets. So fundamentally, that needs to be a piece of the solution or piece of the puzzle, particularly in the larger countries where you need large amounts of resources. But again, because I have both a Bridgetown hat and a Barbados hat, let me speak a little bit about the Barbados market. Barbados, again, is a very small country. For those who just heard me speak at the V20 session, it's extremely tiny. It's 300,000 people, but I'm actually from Dominica, which is 70,000 people, so much smaller. But the reality is that many of these even small countries have very liquid capital markets. You mentioned that I'm on external service from the World Bank Group. Specifically, I'm on external service from the International Finance Corporation, so the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And we've found, with my IFC hat, that in many countries, particularly in Eastern Caribbean countries which have highly liquid markets, international or foreign capital is not as competitive as domestic capital. The problem in domestic markets is threefold. Firstly, it's cultural. In small countries that do not have a tradition of investing in infrastructure, because that infrastructure was already there in pre-colonial times, say the water sector or power projects had been developed 50, 60, 70 years ago under the colonial era, there isn't a tradition, number one. Number two, for project developers that are looking for larger projects, the markets are very small. So often you find developers from markets that are liquid going to other markets that are just larger and taking their capital externally. And I think, the third concern is that there are very few large enterprises that are considered bankable or credit-worthy. In the context of Barbados, the national power company, Barbados Light and Power, is highly credit-worthy. It's a highly functioning utility, 6-7% power losses. It's really quite exceptional. But domestic banks are maxed out on their ability to lend to that entity. So where else are they going to put their money? Perversely, in liquid markets, the domestic private sector in the small liquid markets has the same challenge as the international private sector, which is limited pipeline or insufficient diversification. So how then do you get them to diversify that money that's sitting in bank accounts looking for a home into projects in the resilience space, right? There may not be enough projects in mitigation, there may not be enough hotel projects, but there are definitely projects in the resilience space. And this is where I think we need to look at leveraging public financing. Many of those projects do not have either a revenue stream or a sufficiently large revenue stream, but they do, over time, provide tremendous economic value. So how do you then bring that domestic capital into solving the roads problem? You may not be able to build a toll road in many of our smaller countries. There's a beautiful new toll road in Nairobi, which I understand is on track to deliver on its revenue projections, or even exceeding them, which is exceptional. But in a market of 70 to 300,000 people, toll roads are going to have limited performance. That doesn't mean that you cannot mobilize that capital into a resilience bond that looks at nature-based solutions, coral reef regeneration, mangrove protection, potentially even looking at swapping out certain parts of the water mains in the country that generally are difficult to do with private capital, but with the right amount of either viability gap financing or de-risking, you can leverage that private financing. Barbados has done some very interesting things to bring the private capital that exists into renewable energy projects by attracting domestic participation into small-scale renewable projects. Much of that is industrial solar projects, it could be rooftop solar projects, but much more can be done outside of the energy space, and it's certainly something that we're beginning to look at now.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give her a round of applause. You raised two things that struck me. The first one being how small economies, like island economies, but other small economies, could actually leverage the global financial markets to meet environment and climate nature objectives in their economies through a better structuring of how you make the offer. And then the second one, which is equally important, is that the Bridgetown initiative actually does have room for the private sector and for domestic capital in general. So thank you for that. So Kurt, let me turn to you. We have been watching and very interested in seeing the development of the sustainable finance framework in the European Union. And we hear that the European Commission has appointed a high-level expert group on sustainable finance to provide inputs into the new strategy that the EU is developing. That would help intervene in private financial flows for the SDGs. So first of all, we are curious, how is this process going? Do you envisage that this will eventually result in mobilizing the additional financial resources we've all been talking about here for the kind of interventions this panel has been discussing? And if you would, what would be the role or could be the role of the EU in supporting Africa and other countries to develop their domestic financial markets?
Thank you very much. Very, very happy and privileged to be here. We commend the African Union, the Kenyan government, and President Ruto for convening this African Climate Summit and to really put Africa on the forefront of the solutions to climate change. I would like to pick up from the Colombian minister when you said we face a climate emergency. That is absolutely true. We are in a critical decade where we need to reduce emissions by 43% globally if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is sticking to 1.5 degree maximum warming. It's also a critical decade for the development and the fight against poverty in Africa. And the two very much go together. And what my proposition here today is that actually the global climate agenda is an agenda, a strategy for growth, for innovation, for investment. That's what we are doing in the European Union with the European Green Deal, which we are developing and implementing as a growth and investment strategy, because we know that a growth model based on fossil fuels, based on wasted of resources, based on environmental degradation has no future. We need a new form of growth. We have agreed with 27 countries democratically that we will reduce our carbon emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions actually, by at least 55% by 2030. And that requires massive investment in Europe. We estimate that we will need to get there, mobilize at least 700 billion euros additional investment per year up to 2030 to achieve this, because we are so locked in a fossil fuel-based system. So we need to mobilize and steer and direct investment, both public and private investment. And that is what we're trying to do through the sustainable finance strategy. Now, this needs to happen at global level. We really need a reform of the global financial system or architecture. And that's actually very much spelled out in the Paris Agreement, which says that we should align all financial flows in accordance with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I really would like to commend Barbados for the Bridgetown agenda, which really has kicked that agenda very high on the attention of our political leaders. We need to work on this at all levels, national, regional, and global. Now, we from Europe would like to welcome the growing interest that we see in carbon pricing globally. In Europe, we are realizing our reduction of emissions in great part thanks to the emission trading system. It is what I would call the workhorse of our climate agenda in Europe. We have achieved in the sectors that are subject to ETS emission reductions of 37% since 2005. And in the last 10 years only, the ETS system has generated 152 billion euros of revenues, which we reinvest in industrial innovation, in social policies, and indeed in climate finance to help the rest of the world, especially the least developed countries. We are ready to share that experience, both in how you can use it to reduce emissions and generate revenues to reinvest in your clean energy system, in your green industrialization agenda. And that's why President von der Leyen, who will be talking to this in the plenary session tomorrow morning, has launched at the Paris Summit on the global financial architecture, a call to action for Paris-aligned carbon markets, with the idea of promoting the expansion and deepening of domestic carbon markets, which also Kenya is now doing and others in Africa, to support the full implementation of the agreed Article 6 rulebook for international compliance markets, and indeed to ensure high integrity in voluntary carbon markets. We would love to see African countries join this call for action, because Africa can be a big and very convincing advocate towards the major emitters in the world to adopt this carbon pricing, but it will also send a signal, a very important signal to the market, that policy frameworks will be based on the right conditions for integrity in carbon markets, and so that there is sharing of benefits with the local communities. That is very important as a condition for carbon markets. Now, all this goes hand in hand with the development of sustainable finance tools and frameworks, such as green taxonomy, disclosure rules for the financial sector, for the corporate sector, but also green bonds, green standards, labels, and many other of these tools, which we in the EU have developed. We continue to develop them, and we find it very encouraging to see that more and more countries in the north and in the south are putting in place such tools. South Africa, for example, has introduced a green finance taxonomy last year, not exactly the same like the European one, but that's fine because every situation is different. Kenya, already in 2019, was the first African nation to issue green bonds, which we welcome a lot. and we have other of these examples in Africa. So the EU and Africa have different starting points, but we have the common imperative of unleashing sustainable finance. As I said, both private and public as well. So you asked us what the EU will do. Well, the EU, the European Union, will continue to support governments and businesses in this direction and in this endeavor. We have the Global Gateway from now until 2027, which will mobilize investment of 300 billion euros, 150 of which will go to Africa. That includes the European Sustainable Development Fund, which will provide guarantees to de-risk and leverage private investment, which we really see as a big opportunity and need in Africa as well. We have launched the Team Europe Commission with member states, the Team Europe Global Green Bond Initiative, to facilitate the flow of private capital into climate and environmental projects in partner countries, notably in Africa. And with the European Investment Bank, which is very present also during this conference, we have now committed 1 billion euros, which will mobilize, we estimate, 15 to 20 billion euros of investments in green bonds in partner countries. We have also set up an international platform on sustainable finance, to which we would invite all countries, including in Africa, to join, so that we have a common direction for this work. And indeed, as you said, Fanny, we have set up a high-level expert group on scaling up sustainable finance in low and middle-income countries, with exactly the ambition of finding what are the right tools, the right financial instruments, the right policy conditions and frameworks that we need in low and middle-income countries to make sure that this investment happens, very much in line with what we hear from Barbados indeed. A last point, if I may. All this must go together with domestic public revenue mobilization. You were absolutely right, but also with conducive, consistent green fiscal and budgetary policies, so that there is consistency in the signals we are sending as governments especially. That can include carbon taxes, as I mentioned, but also the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. And I would like to say that I strongly agree with the minister from Colombia that we not only have to rely on the private sector. The private sector is key. This agenda will not happen without a private sector massive involvement. But we also need to strengthen the public sector. The public sector must have the capacity to direct all these flows and to make sure that there is a revenue for the private sector, but also for society. Where there is potential return on investment, the private sector has to come in, and we have to make sure it does deliver a return on investment. But the climate agenda indeed also has areas for investment, like adaptation, where the return on investment is not that clear. And there, public support will indeed remain very important. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, thank you very much. Let's give Kurt a round of applause. I was very excited to hear two things from you. One, you mentioned the importance of the carbon price setting, and I just want to ask everyone, just look around the room at the posters behind you. Africa's carbon is exciting, Africa's carbon is fun, Africa's carbon is rich. It's definitely worth more than $3 to $5 a ton. So just look at the beautiful carbon on the posters behind you. And the second thing you mentioned is the importance of the domestic financial capital market. So it gives me an opportunity now to turn to Minister Andrew. For as long as I can remember, the UK has supported financial capital development in Africa. Why do you do that? And what are the areas that you see as priority going forward? And then secondly, what would you say that, or why would you say that building domestic financial markets in Africa is important in the context of these ongoing discussions about reforms to the global financial system?
Well, Franny, thank you very much for inviting me to join this very distinguished panel on such a very interesting subject. And your opening question is about why we have always prioritized markets and said how important the private sector is. And perhaps I can come on to that, but it is because most jobs around the world are provided by the private sector and not by governments. And therefore, making sure that the private sector can operate and can use its magic to generate jobs, generate economic activity is incredibly important. I mean, the first answer I would like to make on the UK's commitment to support financial market development Africa is that our support is unequivocal, and we are facing a very difficult moment now at the halfway point to the 2030 SDGs, where the SDGs are way off track, and also there is the danger of a perfect storm coming, where we've got great anger in the global south at failure to deliver. We've got clear and consistent and terrifying evidence of weather events, and we've got a failure to drive and deliver the spirit and the promises from Paris. And we have to head off that perfect storm, and we've got a whole series of meetings now taking place ahead of the COP in the UAE in December, where on all three of those things, we as the members of the international community, working together, binding ourselves together, staying united and not allowing people to divide us between the East and the West, the South and the North, we can, I think, make progress on all three of those, and they are at the heart of what you are saying. Of course, there are terrible headwinds. The invasion of Ukraine by a member of the United Nations Permanent Five, with the multiple shocks which result, the effect on inflation, the effect on food flows, quite apart from the other shocks, have given very great difficulty and problems to all countries, but nowhere more so than in Africa. And our priority must be to create a fairer financial system. It must be to make sure that the multilateral development banks really sweat their assets and deliver a quantum leap in the amount of climate finance that is available. And I think there's a lot of terrific work going on to try and achieve that. But also we need to heed the message so clearly and brilliantly articulated by Mia Mottley, the Bridgetown agenda, which speaks to the heart of all of this. And at the same time as doing all of that, we need to ensure that the private sector, returning to what you said at the beginning, organizations like the British Development Finance Institution, BII, formerly CDC, investing not loans but risk equity in billions of pounds worth across Africa, employing directly something like 1 million people as a result of their investments, harnessing the public and the private sector together, the $60 trillion of pension funds, many of which are looking for a safe and constructive home in attacking climate change and developing safe and good climate instruments. We need to make sure that all of that is happening. And it's vital that we harness private capital effectively to achieve these climate ambitions. Domestic resources, such as the continent's combined 1 trillion institutional assets as well, have a critical role to play and could be put to pro-climate and pro-nature use, and yet they are vastly untapped. And shifting domestic resources, like these pension funds, which I've referred to, from traditional concentration in government treasuries into green investments, it also requires regulatory changes to allow more cross-border investments by pension funds and to optimize the allocation of assets. And the launch of the Pan-African Fund Managers Association, which I think we may be hearing more about later today, can stimulate precisely this thinking. Our thinking, and I shall be saying more about this in the coming weeks, when the British government paper, the White Paper, is released, which we are consulting on. It's Britain's hope and effort to provide some more thinking, some new thinking, both on how we put these SDGs back on track and how we can do more to achieve our climate finance aims. And we are busy consulting people across the world, in our own country, think tanks and universities, but around the world through our British Foreign Office missions to capitalize on thinking and trying to submit in a very humble way this paper to drive forward these agendas towards the end of the year. Because I think now is the time when we have to avoid that perfect storm and delivers. And this government paper will include ways of reforming the international global financial system to ensure our financial architecture is improved, more fit for purpose, and enables these greater levels of finance, which I've talked about, to flow. And in their jurisdictions, African countries are also introducing progressive green finance policies and regulations to strengthen their ability to benefit fully from these reforms, and new conduits are also required to channel this finance and ensure that the absorptive capacity of financial markets in Africa is increased. And having the necessary market infrastructure is therefore fundamental to attract, allocate, and scale green capital. And that is why I'm delighted to see that FSD Africa's work supporting the establishment of the Ethiopia Stock Exchange, the EABX, a fixed income securities exchange in Kenya, and launching key institutions like the Nairobi International Financial Center are taking place. And all of these will allow local capital markets to play their intermediation role more effectively. It is critical that we reduce the cost of finance, which, as we know, is currently significantly more expensive in Africa, undermining the economics of much needed local projects. It is ridiculous that our children in London can borrow for housing for 30 or 35 years at 5%, when African countries cannot get anything like that length of time and are faced with very high interest rates. We have to ensure that the system, not least through the G20 mechanisms, more accurately addresses the needs for debt restructuring so that we don't see what we saw in Zambia, which was a 2-year delay, which is completely wrong. Blending concessional finance from development banks and donors with private finance can obviously mobilize private capital, as others have said on this panel, particularly from cautious institutional investors. And finally, FSD Africa's investment of £10 million contribution to Acre Impact Capital Export Finance Fund is a very interesting case in point. It will help infrastructure projects that support mitigation and adaptation to access guarantee financing from export credit agencies by covering the commercial debt tranche. I think this is a great demonstration of how concessional finance can be catalytic, improving the effectiveness of export guarantee facilities while allowing local financial institutions to invest by managing their exposure to risk. This one initiative will give improved access to basic services for close to 500,000 people and generate over 2,000 jobs. Together, all these examples of innovative financing are a great reflection of what this summit is communicating, that it is possible to do transactions in Africa, that deals are happening. We look forward to working with FSD Africa and partners across the continent to help mobilize private finance in Africa while we work to reform the international financial system to deliver on both development and climate objectives. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. A round of applause to the Minister. I'm very pleased to hear you say 3 things: that despite this polycrisis world that we are facing, your government is looking at the future and financing climate and nature, focusing on creating dynamism in the capital markets in Africa that would help Africa help itself, and then also putting your money where it matters in terms of demonstrating that initiatives like public-private partnerships through bilateral aid could be catalytic and innovative. So thank you very much for that support, particularly to now in my new hat as a chair of FSD Africa, to support those initiatives here on the continent. So we've come to the end of this panel. I want to ask you to lend a strong hand of applause to the panelists who have done an excellent job here. And to say now that I'm handing over to my colleague, Dr. Evans, who's going to moderate the next panel. So 90 minutes will be 3 segments of exciting 90 minutes. Dr. Evans.